Hello and welcome to Strong Talk, a podcast dedicated to the discussion of equity, diversity, and family as it relates to mental health and addictions. A space not only to talk about challenges, but to explore and to create space for solutions. I'm your host, Vic Armstrong, and I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey. I'm joined today by MSNBC and NBC News journalist and author Richard Lui. Richard, thank you for joining me today. So glad to have you with us.
Vic, thanks for doing this, and it's good to be visiting with you.
Absolutely. So let's just jump right into this. Richard, you are
Yeah.
the first Asian American male to anchor a daily national cable news show, and that was at CNN Worldwide. But in order to do so, you would have to navigate a very complex cultural environment. In fact, you describe yourself as someone who dropped out of high school effectively and almost flunked out twice, and you were kicked out of one school, which you say was probably due to undiagnosed mental stress. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and how you go from there to becoming someone who's so widely known in this media space?
Yeah, Vic, I mean, the high school thing was, I only reflect back now, and when we sit together and have conversations like this, you're ready, you're a veteran of this discussion, and sometimes bringing up those topics aren't the easiest to do.
Hmm.
To have it's fine if you don't have a good listening ear in quotes for that discussion. But when I look back at the high school years and you know almost flunking twice, I had a great principal that really cared about his students, who stopped me
Hmm.
from letting that happen, and then getting kicked out of one school because it came so close. And I went to the second one, almost happened again. And I wasn't going to class. I probably had 100 absences
Hmm.
a year, my last 2 years, each year. And was not a happy kid, although I was a happy kid generally speaking. And I was just
Yeah.
really disenchanted with the whole competition and the people saying they were one thing but another. And then you overlap that. My father was a pastor, and I had this big belief in people, or I
Yeah.
thought, and it all came crashing down right around those 2 years about you say you're one thing, but you really act the other way.
Yeah.
And I had grown up thinking it was going to be that perfect, that nirvana of the way
Mhm.
people would express themselves and present themselves. And it wasn't.
Right.
And that's what I think kind of hit my brain and my heart at the same time was you're not, and I know we're not here to necessarily talk about religion and faith and stuff like that, but I was like, I was this 12-year-old, 13-year-old dynamo that thought I was going to save the world, and I was going to do it by saving you. And
Hmm.
I lost a lot of friends, but I think it
Yeah.
all kind of came together.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm also a preacher's kid. My father was a pastor, actually
Yeah.
pastored for 48 years and retired from pastoring about 6 years ago. But like
Wow,
you,
that's
I
great.
I grew up in a what I call now a very small world because everything was black and white. And
Yeah.
like I heard my
Yes.
whole life growing up that I was going to be a preacher one day, so I believed it.
Yeah.
And so I created that narrative. But it is interesting. You say you start to learn that the world is not exactly as you thought it was, and that everything
Yeah.
is not as black and white as you thought it was. What is
Yeah.
that like though, as you do start to figure out, as you say, that everyone's not what you thought they were, the world is not as simple a place as you thought it was.
Yeah.
What's it like learning that in your formative years the way you did?
It's a lifelong lesson, as you know, Vic, that folks don't fit into one or two buckets or three buckets or four buckets. We fit into millions of buckets, if you will, if you
Yeah.
allow that, if you want to use that concept. At that time, I went to a Christian camp. I grew up in California, Northern California, and we would go to
Mhm.
Christian camps in summer. And I went up to one at Mount David, and it was Mount Hermon, excuse me. And what happened was I was like, wait, these folks aren't, they're supposed to be Christian folks, but they're so materialistic.
Mm.
They're caring about the sort of board shorts they're wearing, and the brands on their t-shirts and this and that. And I was like, this is not what I learned. And so
Uh-huh.
when I realized that the world was not what I thought it was supposed to be, I actually had a panic attack
Wow.
And I didn't know it was a panic attack. Because I had heart issues as a kid as well. I'm just laying it down here. I had heart issues as a 12 or 13-year-old where I was skipping beats and we didn't know what it was. It was a And so when I was up at church camp, and then I had that realization that all that I was saying to other folks was completely wrong.
Hmm.
I started breathing. I had all the symptoms of a panic attack, I guess is what I'm saying. And I did not know how to deal with it. An ambulance came to pick me up. Here I was at a teenage, church camp, and I was being wheeled away in an ambulance because
Wow.
I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
They said nothing was wrong with me, but that is the extreme of what I felt at that time.
Yeah. What did your parents do with it at the time? Or did you talk to them about it?
I didn't. I think we attributed that event, by the way, to
Uh-huh.
heart condition.
Okay.
Um, my mom, a teacher, my dad, the pastor, and then the social worker were more of, how do we support you, Richard? You let us know.
Yeah.
And so they actually did allow me to stay home from school, despite what their gut told them was
Yeah.
right, like I should be going to school.
Yeah. Now, where did you grow up?
San Francisco,
Okay.
California.
Okay. So
My
you grew
dad,
up in a major
yeah,
city. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So and in San Francisco, so you grew up in a community where you actually did get to see a lot of other people who look like you, who had similar backgrounds to yours.
But this is the thing. I certainly rejected those who are new Asians to America,
Uh-huh.
and I got mad at myself later in my late 20s, early 30s, because I realized I was rejecting my grandfather, right? My grandfather took the risk to come to America, and here I was rejecting these new Asians to America because I was
Mhm.
better than them, right? I didn't eat the things they ate. I didn't talk the way they talked. I didn't walk the way they walked. And that's kind of pretty disgusting to reject your
Yeah.
own narrative because you want to feel better personally.
Right.
And the other dynamic that I want to bring up in growing in San Francisco is people think it's this great fabric of folks living together, and
Uh-huh.
if you live there, that's not true, and that we all live in our ghettos,
Yeah.
and that is not good. I mean, are you from California? Did you live there at any point?
No, no, I have lived my entire life in North Carolina. I grew up
Okay.
in a very small town. The population of my hometown is around 4,000. So that's how
Mm,
small Plymouth, North Carolina is. I live in Charlotte now, which is a more urban area. But
yeah,
so
beautiful.
much of my narrative about myself growing up was really shaped by that small town. And so there were a lot of things I had to unlearn about what's real and what life is really like. And I get the sense that in some ways, you kind of had the same experience. You
I
you
did.
you think and then you have to unlearn a lot of things in order to really proceed on.
Being a journalist was, I think, a manifestation of that curiosity.
Yeah, yeah,
Because I was like, oh wait, I thought things were like all neatly laid out, and then they're not. And so I think as we go through, when I was going through those mental health challenges, and I didn't know that that's what they were, the
yeah.
panic attack is one of the pinnacle events, right? Um, is that I would try learning different things in different ways,
Hmm.
and we all do it somehow. Like we might become a journalist, we might be a community outreach professional, we
Right.
might become a psychologist or psychiatrist, a therapist. We stretch in different ways. And for me, I think it was journalism, um, in college, and then actually in high school, and then in college, and then now. I've had different stops with journalism along the way, and I think each of them were different points of me saying, I want to learn about what I don't know,
Hmm.
because I know what I don't know is not helping me
Yeah,
personally.
yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I think so much of our journey in some ways is similar because I think I end up being a social worker probably for very much the same reason. I think my curiosity kind of took
Mm,
me in that direction. I grew up thinking that I
mm,
wanted to be a banker, and I actually when I came out of undergrad, I was going to be a banker, but it really was because of this narrative I had created for myself about who I was supposed to be But then later realized, this is not who I want to be, and I think my curiosity took me in a totally different direction, much like what you're describing.
Did you love that aha? I mean, it may have been more than one aha moment here, Vic, but you're at
Yeah,
least telling me about one. Did
yeah.
some will love it, some won't. I mean, did you like that?
You
Oh
know,
man, look at that.
it's interesting because it was kind of an evolution for me, and I don't think that I really had the aha moment until I realized, you know what, I ended up in the right place. It wasn't an aha moment leading me into that place. It was, you know, I ended up leaving my job in banking after about 3 years, and I took a
Mm,
job working for a Department of Social Services just to have something to do until I figured out what I wanted to do next. And then I realized, this is where I'm supposed to be. And ended up going back to graduate school, got a master's degree, ended up becoming a clinical social worker, and that set me on the path to what I do today. But somewhere along the way, I realized I had, and it would probably seem as though I just kind of stumbled into that space, but I know now I didn't really stumble into it. It
yeah,
was
right.
really something inside me
Yeah.
was drawing me to it.
Yes.
But I'm in the right place now, and I think for you, you clearly ended up in the right space in journalism.
Yeah. There's some for me, and folks will often ask, "How did you leave Citibank to become a journalist?"
Hmm.
And was it like is it? And I don't know because it doesn't make sense by the books, if you will.
Right.
But the reality was, hit a certain intersection, and that intersection, which was we did a new business in fintech, and then completely switched gears. And because I was like, I don't want to do any more of this.
Yeah.
There's some things in our lives that we're done. Like for you saying banking
Right.
and finance, you're like, I'm done. And
Yeah.
my heart tells me, my brain tells me, and
Yeah.
look, there's an intersection in front of me. I'm turning on my blinkers and I'm going to move. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's okay. I mean, you don't always need to have like this laid out long plan. Sometimes the door opens and you're like,
Yeah.
well, of course,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what I'm gonna do.
But now here's the difference for me and you. You end up becoming the first Asian male anchor of a major network, and you don't just happen into that. That seems like it takes some intentionality and some focus to be able to do that. How did you get to that point where were able to apply that kind of focus to your career?
You know what happened? Because I didn't get into the industry to be that, but I realized as I was exploring the move into that industry. So like we all did. And when you moved to social work, you may have talked to one or two folks that were social workers
Right.
that had a similar journey that you had up to that point. And when I reached out to look for other Asian males that were national anchors, there were none.
Hmm.
There were zero. I had
Yeah.
none to speak with to figure out what that's like. Now, does that mean that I couldn't speak with a black anchor or a Latino anchor, male anchors is what I mean,
Right.
because I know the dynamic and gender is
Yeah.
different in broadcast media because of the way it's physicality, right? What we see is very important in broadcast news.
Right.
And so I did look to other male anchors of color to
Right.
get us an understanding. Some were open to discussing it, some were not. And I was perplexed to those who didn't want to talk about it, but now I understand why they
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah.
And so the shift for me was it became part of why I did it, but not the initial reason why I did
Right.
it.
Yeah.
And it's just like reporting on communities of color. I didn't become a journalist to be a civil rights reporter, for
Right.
instance.
Right. Yeah.
But after starting my first story early on when I began in news radio news, rather, it was three stories stand out to me. One was Dianne Feinstein being the first woman from California being elected to the U.S. Senate, Magic Johnson with HIV, and three, Rodney King.
Mm.
And fast forward to my days at CNN and then at 30 Rock, and I'm standing in the streets of Ferguson and Baltimore and New York, and,
Yeah.
and I'm telling the same story.
Yeah.
of Rodney King over and over, if you will, again and again and again and again. And I'm a person of color, and I've seen these stories, and I've lived in these communities, and I realized at that moment that being a journalist of color helped me tell these stories. I wasn't a black journalist. I was an AAPI journalist, but I felt like I understood an element of what
Yeah.
it meant to be other,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it was angering. It was sad. I was very sad when I was reporting on Michael Brown, um, and then Freddie Gray, and I continue. And then George Floyd. I
Mhm.
remember when I was reporting on George Floyd, Vic, and it was just
Yeah.
I was in the middle of Brooklyn, and all the crowds were out, and and I was telling because I was up all night reporting live, and there's just a real, and I'm not the civil rights leader. I
Right.
mean, I was watching the civil rights leaders, in that scope of 7, 8 years, and
Hmm.
I was like, I got their face,
Right.
because I would look at them as they would walk by in all of these different cities, and there's something in their face that was so telling, and I didn't know what it was, Vic, but it was they were resolute, but they were
Hmm.
also resolutely strong and resolutely sad.
Right.
And as well, they knew this might be their last time to show others
Yeah.
what it means to exercise our great American power to say this is wrong. And it's tough to describe all of those things in these leaders' faces, but I I was channeling indirectly that message in my reporting, which is not what I thought I was starting to report to do.
Yeah.
But now when I look back, not that long ago, right? I feel very honored to try to share that story with America
Yeah.
because they needed to feel that face.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
if you're not there, you don't know. You don't. When I'm there, like versus what we're doing together today, when
Right.
you're there, it's just so in your bones.
Yeah, it's amazing as you share because so much of your journey is different, but so much of it I find really commonalities in it because I do a lot of work now in the health equity space. I didn't start out
Oh,
in the equity space. I started out
yeah,
to be a
exactly.
clinician, and
Yeah,
initially when I first became a clinician, I was working in very rural communities. It gave me an opportunity to really see the impact of some of generational trauma
yeah,
because I was actually in these rural communities. I was actually the clinician for the grandparent, for the parent, for the child. I was
hmm,
seeing men who were court ordered for domestic violence. I was seeing the women who they,
yeah,
had violated, and so I was seeing all these different things, and but really seeing it from my lens and dealing with it from my lens really is what kind of pushed me into this equity space, I think, because I did start to feel like I see it differently. I see a
yeah.
different side to this, and I can tell the story differently. And I hear that in your story. The thing that also sits with me with your story, though, is you've dealt with some really, really heavy subject matter. I mean, you talk about Mike Brown, you talk about George Floyd, you talk about Magic Johnson. That's a lot. What do you do with all that? How do you maintain your own mental well-being when you're really
Yeah.
dealing with these heavy, heavy subjects?
Only recently, I think, have news networks realized we have to deal with our trauma as journalists
Yeah.
because we're there, and so we've begun to have in a very open way, which is good, an open and productive way. If you go to the ninth floor in room 2918, come on by. We've got some folks if you want to sit and talk about what we're going through because we
Yeah.
have had a horrible, horrible 10 to 20 years in terms of just traumatic event after
Mhm.
another. The number of mass shootings, Vic,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that I'm probably in the top 2 or 3 at 30 Rock that have covered these in terms of number of hours
Yeah.
I've covered mass shootings, and Newtown, Connecticut is just one of them, but one of the most saddest stories that I had to live through, and this is after Virginia Tech, and I think the way I've tried to be productive and help myself is to have these conversations
Yeah.
um, with you, um, to try to access my true feelings about these incidents
Yeah.
and to go there. Like when I was just describing to you Rodney King and then Michael Brown, as I stood over the location where his body was and I spoke with those who raised him. um, I can see the pictures and I want to see the pictures because I
Yeah.
want to share it and I want to and I think and I'm not a professional, but being productive about what was tragic is what I've really tried to do.
Hmm.
Um, and the way I've been trying to be productive about it is to focus on how we're different to find our sameness.
Yeah.
And throughout my reporting, that's and my films, I won't tell you that, but hopefully you'll see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. But it's not easy to do, and you do it well. But I can remember, becoming somewhat disenchanted with the social work profession,
oh, yeah.
because I felt like we were not doing enough to really call out things like systemic racism and some of the challenges I was seeing in Black and Brown communities.
Yes,
And
that's right.
and then a few years ago, it's the profession kind of stepped up and said, "We've missed it. We need to do better. We need to
Mm,
address equity," and began to take it on more so. And I can imagine that in the journalism field, there got to be times when there are stories that you want to tell, but the
mhm,
field or the network is not ready for you to tell the full story.
yeah.
Have you had that experience? And if so, what do you do with
Mhm.
that?
There's some similarities. You as a social worker, you saw so much out there, and as you just described, you had to solve a lot of society's challenges as a social worker. And my father, as a social worker as well, he loved the church, and he couldn't raise enough money that he couldn't earn enough money to raise 4 kids though.
Hmm.
So he picked the next highest paying job, social worker. Right. He a smart guy, right? I was like,
Yeah.
Dad, I mean, come on now. I mean, you're picking anyway, but he loved the work as you do
Yeah.
and felt the same shackles of I see so much and I can only do this much because these are
Yeah.
only the programs that exist.
Right.
And for me as a journalist, what I've learned to do is get the timing and the framing right to get the story out.
Hmm.
And as a good friend of mine, Tony Waller, who I just spoke with last week, who is focused on racial justice at Walmart for a decade or more, tells me, you'll see a lot of things, and it might be called a duck, it may be called a cow, and it may be called a horse. But as he told me, my mama always told me, so long as it's giving me milk, I don't care what you call it. So in this case, there's a lot of stories I see, and so
Yeah.
long as I'm giving you milk, I feel okay about it. And
Yeah.
I'm not lying, I'm not misrepresenting. I just know that to get to the end, sometimes you might enter door A, B, C, or D. Everybody says it's got to be B. I'm saying, but A and C and D are still truthful,
Yeah.
and I'm going to get you there, and I'm still going to get you milk. And that is, I think, so. For instance, um, when and I spent a lot of time in Ferguson, weeks and weeks and weeks. And the first day of all of those weeks, um, a daughter and a mother come up to me and say, "We have this program. We've been working on healing in the community, and it's the children that are leading it." It was day one, Vic. So I was like, "Okay, we can't do it today, but let me get your information. I'm going to talk to you in the next 3 or 4 days, and we're going to do this story."
Mhm.
And the key is, as journalists, I think if we can think in the arc and go back to that arc and think forward to that arc, then we, I think, are doing a better job as opposed to just focusing on the next 24 hours. Think about next week, right? Because healing a lot in the mental health journey is there's certain phases. And when I talk about the healing story, which are these amazing young girls in the
Mhm.
town of Ferguson that were doing good work to heal through the way they would outreach cross community. It wasn't good for day one. It was
Right.
good for day 3 and 4.
Yeah. Your story too reminds me of, like I always tell people, especially when we're talking about bringing people into the field, into the social work field, the mental health field. And I always say, you can teach people a skill set. You can teach people policy. You can't teach people to care. And I can hear from the way you talk about the stories that you tell that you actually care about how it impacts people. You care about, getting it right. Which brings me to your book. Enough About Me, The Unexpected Power of Selflessness, because I hear so much selflessness in the way that you describe the work that you do. Where does that come from?
It's funny, Vic, because in the story, in the book, Enough About Me, I share a lot of examples about me, which is the most that within itself is potentially problematic. And I joke because as I was going through writing the book, I I realized I needed to also understand my own journey of discovering it
Yeah.
and how I failed and what formed my view on this great golden rule that all religions hold. And um, I remember when the agent actually reached out to me and said, let's do something because I see that you're doing a lot of caregiving, and I cared for my dad who had Alzheimer's for
Mhm.
about 7 years, and I would fly from New York to San Francisco about 3 times a month. And one of the stories I tell in the book about me, the book called Enough About Me. And the reason why I told the story about me was because, when I was young and I was getting kicked around in the schoolyard, I came home and my dad was putting me to bed and he said, how's your day? And I said, well, folks are kind of picking on me because I'm shorter than everybody else.
Mm.
I'm a small kid and I look like this. And he said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to defend yourself or not? And if you do, there's a guy at church who just joined, and he happens to be a Shaolin Kung Fu master. And I was like, Dad, I'm already called Bruce Lee in the schoolyard, and you're going to teach me what do you not know about this situation, right? What? So I realized that later. I was like, oh, that's he's maybe not quite understanding, but I understood what he was trying to say.
Yeah.
And he,
Yeah.
he came back to me 3 nights later and tucking me in, and he really did say, so have you thought about it? And I said, yeah, I think I need to defend myself.
Yeah.
And so began at the age of 9 my lessons in kung fu to beat off the folks that were calling me Bruce Lee. Um, and truly enough, it's true enough. I did get strong enough in mind and in body so that I could lower those incidents
Mhm.
along the way. And so when my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the story I tell in the book is he taught me how to fight, and now was my turn to fight for him
Wow. Yeah.
because he couldn't fight.
Yeah.
My poor dad with Alzheimer's, and he even got pushed over once during the early phases of this anti-Asian hate wave
Yeah.
about 8 years ago, and I was really taken aback by anybody who would do that to a person. Bottom line, number two, a senior citizen. Number three, an individual who was battling Alzheimer's. And
Yeah.
he taught me how to fight. And Vic, I had to do the same. And the book was a lot about that very idea of the way we learn to stand up for others. And and we live in a time, as you know so well, where social workers who I absolutely 1,000,000% support because they're standing up for others and they're standing up for values. And it wasn't easy for my father, my sister, who is now a social worker. It's not easy for her, and it's not easy for you. I know it, but one of the noblest jobs and professions and journeys, vocations
Mm.
that anybody can pick.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I believe it.
And as you're sharing too, the thing I loved about you actually talking about yourself in the book is that oftentimes for any TV personality, what we often see in the public is really more of a caricature of that person. We see an image of that person, and we think we know them, but we
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
really because we don't know their journey. We see them on the
yeah.
screen, and when you peel back the layers and really talk about, this is the person I am, and this is how I got here, it makes it much more personal. And I really feel like even you as a journalist, I can understand your perspective better now. I understand now why you seem to lean into certain things more so than others. It's really a helpful perspective because it helps you appreciate the story that much more. But along those lines, you talked about how one of the things that you've seen and we've all seen over the past several years is this escalation in Asian hate. um, and so when you look at that, and especially as a journalist out here covering these incidents, can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like? Because I believe you also, I forget if it was
Mhm.
your grandparents that immigrated here.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And in fact, my grandparents, three of them came to America illegally. I am the grandson of illegal immigrants.
Mm,
And one of the points around that is that, Vic, I was thinking about how to understand that because I discovered that my grandparents came here illegally when I was, I think, 15, because
mhm,
my grandma passed, and we had my last name's Louis, as you know, Lui. We went to the cemetery, and the tombstone said Wong, Wong, and I was like, Dad, what's the? I mean, can we spell? Did we get a really good deal on this thing? What's up? I mean, it's a wrong name,
mm,
and my dad didn't know. He goes and asks his oldest sister, and she says, Stephen, mom and dad have, and I'm paraphrasing, they've been they've been lying. They came to America with papers that were purchased. They
mm,
weren't real. And I didn't process that until I was on set at CNN. I remember I was doing a story on immigration, illegal immigration, and during the break, I just sat there and I was like that the light bulb goes off. But that was like
yeah.
20 years later, and it took me that long to understand that story was my story. And the flip side of that story is that, my grandfather came here illegally, and, am I glad he did it? I am. Am I glad he broke the law? No. But I'm also then heartened by this country because he came here because he was a poor Chinese farmer, poverty,
Mm,
right? Just
right.
absolute poverty. And he came here at 12, 15, 12 or 13, I think. And it's because the family saved up money and sent one kid across the ocean. He got here, and the whole family and he was hoping that his children and grandchildren and great grandchildren would not have to grow up poor Chinese farmers.
Yeah.
And what's amazing is that his grandson became a national news anchor. That's America.
That's
And if
America.
we can't forget those storylines that
Yeah.
we all have lived through. This
Yeah.
is our country through great pain, and this is just the Asian American story. There are
Mhm.
so many others that you and I both know so well, but it is being able to accept that these imperfect journeys can be perfect sometimes in their
Yeah.
own way.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Fantastic. You know, you and I both we talk a little bit about this. We have this background as preachers' kids, and I find now that I do a lot
I
of
don't want to
work.
say anything. I now I know you, Vic. Once you said you're a PK, I was like, okay, I got you. I
Yeah,
got you now.
but you know, so today, you know, a lot of the work I do in the social workspace, especially if when I'm trying to you know, work within communities, I rely on those roots because I do a lot of work
Yeah.
in the faith community because I realize the impact and the influence that the faith based community has, particularly in communities of color. In your work now, do you tap into the you know your roots growing up as a preacher's kid?
I do. And it was you know, for those who aren't preachers' kids or don't know the stereotype of preachers' kids, we are often the troubled kids.
Yeah,
We're often the ones that go the other way. We reject the preaching of our parents, right? And then we come and we go, and we it's a very complex but also real in terms of a human experience.
right.
And I tap into it a lot because of that imperfection of what I am and what I lived through. Because then I realized, being that narrative of preacher's kid, is that we're all preacher's kids.
Mm,
We all have these great tests of why we're here, and rejecting what people say we should be, and sometimes to a great, you know, the realization that faith or religion was not real, and then real, and then not real, and then real, was a big part of my mental stress, and a
yeah.
question of what was right. Like I was talking about the high school thing, and that was all at once this sort of, well, then why am I here?
Hmm.
W- These people, I thought I knew, and then I didn't, and I wanted the answer, and and that pushed me. And I get that that's not only when you're a teenager, that's the rest of your life. And
Yeah.
so the way I tap into it, like in the book, um, I don't talk about religion now with anybody because it's your journey, right,
Right.
Vic? It's for
Very
you,
That's very
and
personal. Yeah.
it's for you, and I want it to be for you, right? Because it's got to be, whether you choose or not. That's fine. It's for you, and I respect you.
Yeah.
And writing about it in the book was a little strange for me because I don't talk about it now. I just, and not that I'm ignoring it. It's just, I expect me to respect you and respect them. You know, I want to keep it to myself too. And so that was a bit of a change for me, because the last thing I want to do is be preaching about religion to folks.
Right.
And in the book, I was expressing what that difficulty was for me
Yeah.
throughout my life. So yeah, I
Yeah.
do talk about it. It does inform me. I think I see things and I feel things because I went through that,
Yeah.
and that is, you know, what I was saying earlier. Because I was just doing a discussion on journalists and what young journalists or new journalists should be considering. What's your piece of advice? And this is similar to the space you and I are talking about, is number one, invest in everything that you are, everything, not just one thing, and then invest in everything that you are not.
Mm,
And what we have not done, I don't think, and this is the parallel to the religion piece, is that sometimes you're so in that lane that you're not seeing all the other lanes that are right next to
right.
you. And I think as journalists, we we could sometimes do better about investing in what we're not,
Mm,
to tell those stories. And I have really pushed myself to invest in what I am not, or what I think I'm not.
right.
And certainly, I think my faith and my upbringing in religion has given me a perspective on that.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, it was like, you know, religion can sometimes put you in that one lane.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
and one of the big ones is that when I realized my dad wasn't perfect, that was during that high school period. I was like, "Oh boy, this guy is a real dope." Um, Fast forward to the last 7 years, and I was caring for my father intimately, and he was as I was saying earlier, he was so perfect in his imperfection.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and I think that one of the things that I I do find in looking back is that there were some really strong principles and some character building blocks I think that I gained from growing up in a household that was, so rooted in faith, but there was so much I had to strip away later.
Yeah.
um, and then
Mm.
come back to it with my own understanding, as as you talk about, coming back to it with, okay, let me set aside all of the formal stuff and just focus on, what is my relationship
Right.
around my own spirituality. What does that look like?
Yeah.
um,
Yep.
what I did find.
It's rediscovering why
Yeah,
we like the color blue, if you
yeah,
will.
yeah. If I can ask you, because I also, partly because I think of being growing up in a household that was such a household built on faith principles, but also being a young black male, I was always given this narrative of being stoic, of being strong, of never showing vulnerability. But I think as
Mm.
you and I both sit here and talk now, we both have become very comfortable, I think, with being vulnerable and
Yeah.
expressing vulnerability. Do you know where that came from, or when you realized that you were okay with that?
Oh man, that is such a great question. I think there's seeds that are planted along the way, and
Yeah.
then they start to just foment in our brain, our hearts, our bodies, and when my dad came to me in high school, and we just got back from, he picked me up, and we're sitting in the car, and he starts to cry, and I'm like,
Mm,
Dad, what's going on? He said, well, your mom and myself are not getting along so well,
mm,
and we're not sure what's next. And I didn't know what to say. I really did not. Um, but I realized what he showed me, what I thought was weakness when he did that.
mhm,
Again, going back to what we were just talking about 2 minutes ago, is now today I realized that was strength.
yeah.
And he continued to be that way. I thought for so many times, like, man, my dad's so weak. Sure enough, it can be weak.
Mm,
And that's okay, I guess, is my point. Is sometimes we are weak. We can't ignore the fact that we have weak points. And him being open to showing that to us, because he didn't do that because I'm number three of four. He
mm,
didn't do that with number one and number two, but he did do it with number three and number four.
mhm,
And so I think the gift he gave was this consideration that it's okay. So sure enough, um, my current partner and I, she and I have known each other. We've been dating 5 years, or we're dating for 5 years, and she would always joke that I would always cry in front of her. And I
mm,
was like, yeah, I did. Why am I so comfortable in doing that? And I realized that it was my dad.
mhm.
My mom would not do that, and and then going through the journey of caring for him intimately, um, I think was a reassociation and a relearning of what what I learned from him along the way,
Yeah.
because I was there with him every day, and you know understanding that again, his weakness was giving me strength.
Yeah. So what that whole experience as a caregiver for your father, what would you say were the headline lessons that you took from that experience?
Oh gosh, I don't go a day without talking about caregiving now,
Mm,
for now the last 8 years, and I had no idea that that would be the outcome. My shift in focus and the reason for being and why I get up is exploring that topic.
yeah.
Journalism is important to me, but the bigger thing is how we care for each other in the caregiving context. And I think as I wrote in the book, I really do believe we have forgotten the beauty and the imperfection of caring for others. And
Yeah.
and and that is, my dad is laughing all the way to the bank the man who had Alzheimer for 7 years and couldn't talk at the end, and wouldn't talk. He stopped talking for the last 2 years, and I joked that he's laughing all the way to the bank because he got his errant pastor's kid son to write a book on selflessness in the end, and he really didn't have Alzheimer's at all, and he's just going, I got you, Richard. See, you know.
Wow. That is something. So what was the end result? He did not have Alzheimer's.
He did.
You say he did. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you said he did
I,
not.
I'm I'm joking that he didn't because he
Ah,
wanted to get his son to write a book
got it, got it, got it,
about caregiving.
got it,
No, he did, but it was not a book I expected to be writing, put it that way. So the outcome of all this caregiving was I'm doing things I never thought I would do. Doing a book on selflessness. I've done 2 films on caregiving over the course of 7, 8 years. I report on caregiving. What I do in community now is largely driven by that,
Mhm.
and that's not what I thought. I mean,
Right.
and but I'm glad.
Yeah. What about your own self-care? What does that look like? What does your self-care routine look like?
My self-care routine has so me focusing so much on caregiving and the book, for instance, those are really self-open explorations about what it means to have gone through this. There is a chapter in the book that's about unmitigated selflessness, which was really about giving too much, and that's also a mental health challenge. It was for my mom. Um, it was potentially for me as I was, getting in. I'd finish a shift, Vic, and I'd be in the subway around 3:30, 5 hours after I got off shift, flying back, and I would sit in the subways, and I'd be wondering, what am I doing? And so my self care has been to write and talk about not only what I'm going through personally, but also those who are in parallel, in similarity with me, going through this. And for the second movie, Unconditional, which we did include my family, the most intense therapy sessions you can ever imagine, because you had your editor and your producer, and I'm the director, but because I'm also in the movie, asking me questions about, well, what were you thinking in
Mm,
that frame? And you, as a director, you're making a decision to keep that or position that sequence that way. And I had to really think why personally and emotionally I felt that was the right way to go. And so and you hear this from other folks, it's their therapy and their self-care is through their work.
mhm.
And this truly became that. And I had to be very honest and vulnerable in those discussions, which at the end of these editorial calls, which we would have every week, I was like, wow, I just said a lot. I really said a lot that I did not expect I would ever say out loud.
Yeah. From your journalistic view, you see a whole lot more of the world than a lot of us do, and you see the world at its best. You also sometimes see the world at its worst. Um, when you look at where
Yeah.
we are today as a country, as a nation, what gives you hope?
Yeah. um, um, there's a whole lot more good people than there are bad. A whole lot.
Yeah.
I mean, scores more. Yeah, we tell the story of the sole gunman. We tell the story of that horrible politician saying X, Y, or Z. But I told you the story earlier of the mother and the daughter coming to me of the day after Michael Brown's shooting, and then all of the protests or the mass shootings in Bataclan in Paris. I meet far more people that tell me we're better than we are bad.
Yeah.
We're that people are good, and it is stories like that that make me feel. and reassured as a journalist and reassured as a person outside of it that there are, and the goodness out there is
Yeah.
real. And I know it feels like it isn't
Yeah.
sometimes, but we just have to make sure that those knuckleheads that we got to report on sometimes don't get the power that they have sometimes to create great catastrophe. But the better people, the good people, are it is. If I could tell as many stories as I want to about that, I'd love to. And
Yeah.
my caregiving work is about that. It is about the 100 million family caregivers, unpaid, untrained in this country. 1 in 3 people. Is that not the good stuff?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is really, it makes me very heartened. It makes me want to, and that's the stories that I try to tell. You
Yeah.
know, I
Yeah.
and I'm it's really invigorating.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, is journalism, is it more art or more science?
It is both.
Both.
And I didn't answer your question. Um, you can't have one without the other in a good story. You can't have one without the other in a human journey. And I'm always looking for the science as well as the heart,
Yeah.
as the creation and the crafting of the story.
Yeah.
Um, one of the stories that was a little bit of both, um, is again when we try to share, or not share, when we try to show the analogies or the similarities of
Yeah.
communities, because then you'll go to some of the numbers that show we're similar, um, and then those that are different. And that certainly is not only crafting that, but also showing the numbers that say that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. I've actually found myself, and I've had to call myself on this, that oftentimes, especially it seems like with the morning news shows, they will oftentimes have a feel good story. They'll show a story about
Mhm.
a soldier coming home and greeting his family, or some cute video on TikTok or something. And I found myself at one point getting frustrated with those stories, like, why are they wasting my time with this? Why are they spending time showing me this? What's the real news? And I realized, that I was allowing myself to get to a place where I was expecting, really, my news media to just feed me the bad news. And I really had to take a step back. I ended up taking a step back and just kind of not watching news at all for a little while. Um,
Sure.
but I did find myself, kind of going to that very pessimistic place. And I can
Sure.
imagine
Yeah.
that as a journalist, sometimes you'd have to take a step back and not allow yourself to get drawn into a dark or negative place.
Yeah, and yes, to answer your question. And number two is to understand the layers of what is category is not all one category of bad and good.
Yeah.
And the difficult the difficulty that we face is being able to show the shades of gray, like in mental health. In the media space, we overly simplify it as mental sickness. It is not the same.
Right.
You know this as a
Right.
professional,
Yeah.
but it is almost quickly mental health equals mental sickness, and it's mental illness, and it's not the
Right.
same thing.
Right.
And and on top of that, it can be a strength. Through this time with my father, and COVID, yeah, I gained about 5 pounds around my belly, right? 5, 10 pounds in the belly. But I also tell folks I got a couple of pounds of a spare tire in my brain as well. And I really realized that analogy to be true as, I was doing a series of mental health, um, not podcasts, but seminars. And I remember the first one, it was a middle schooler, and she asked the last question, and she said, "Richard, how come, can I ask this? Because I know we're past time." And I said, "Yeah, go ahead." And she says, "How come during our mental health days at school, it's always about a weakness? Why don't we talk about it as being a strength?" And she forever has changed my view on the way we might approach mental health, just as we do physical health, that it can be a muscle that we have strength in, so that when difficult times happen, just like when we have physical health
Hmm.
and strength, we're able to do well. And I think I know that this is something that you know 6 ways to Sunday, but I think in the broader space of the way we discuss mental health, we got to bring that all those ideas in, that it's not equal to illness, that it can be
Right.
a muscle and it can be a strength. I should be able to say, like when go to the gym, I'm going to the gym. I got to work on this, got to work on
Right.
that, and people go, "Oh, that's great, Vic. Good stuff." But when we say I'm working on my mental health today, and I'm doing this, it's like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a whole thing we got to work on. I think in media and culture, and I think um, we're getting into the space, and you've seen it in the last 10 years, where we can discuss it
Yeah.
openly now in a way we weren't able to do before.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up. I mean, I think that the media it does such a much better job today than even 5 years ago, even pre-COVID. I think in talking about mental health and in talking about suicide, there's a sensitivity to it now that hasn't always been there. Wanting to get the story right, wanting to use the right terminology, and really wanting to show more compassion to people who are experiencing mental health challenges. And I think, people like you and the way that you talk about the stories, I've had a similar conversation some years ago with Kate Snow around the same thing. Is that there
Yeah, yeah,
this sensitivity in talking about mental health? And it used to be though that there were, just people like you and Kate and a handful of folks that seem to get it. But I'm finding more and more now that journalists do get it. And I think the COVID pandemic changed things for a lot of us because I think we all kind of saw ourselves more closely connected to that mental health spectrum than we did in the past. And so, that's if anything positive came out of COVID, I think that may be the one thing.
yeah. And to understand the shades of gray of it, of what it might be as well.
Yeah.
Which I'm with you on that. Totally agree, Vic, that the one of the good things that came out, and there were many of such a bad experience, was that.
Yeah.
And I am so glad that now whether we're close to exactly where we need to be, no, but is it more part of the conversation and in culture? It is, which is really great to see. And for the second film, it was about caregiving and mental health.
Yep. Yep.
And I know some folks wanted it to be these great extremes of mental illness. And I was like, no, 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 no. These are not the same. But what we're showing you in the film is the way all of us, as caregiving ecosystems, we're going through challenges to our mental health.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we wanted to do that because we cared for our loved one. And it's a tough concept to get across. If I told you about it's a movie about caregiving and physical health, that's we kind of get what that might be about potentially because physical health, or you must be training for a big run or what have you. So I think the more we can get it into the zeitgeist, the better.
Yeah. I think too, Richard, the more that we all can do, like you and I today having this conversation, and we're not really having this conversation as a black guy and an Asian guy. We're having this conversation as two guys who love this country, who care about this country, who have lessons that we've learned growing up that we now apply to our
Mhm.
lives. But we're both just trying to figure out how can we make the world a better place. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate that as really kind of being the focal point of this conversation. With that, I'm going to give you the last word. Anything that we have not talked about that you'd like to leave with the audience as we wrap up?
Mm. Um, we've covered a lot, Vic, and I agree with you. And I can't help but think of another North Carolinian who had pushed me to explore these concepts of caregiving, and that was Senator Elizabeth Dole,
Ah, yeah.
who is one of my mentors. And so she wasn't about, in the time I've known her in the last 10 years, when she asked me to be part of her military caregivers campaign, Hidden Heroes, I didn't know what I was stepping into. And I I realized that we had a big gap in culture of understanding what caregivers are going through, and there's so many of us, right? 100 million. And I remember sitting down with her and I said, Senator Dole, I figured out what I can do since I'm in media and journalism. I'm going to do a documentary about caregivers. And she was so sweet. She said, "Oh, that's great, Richard. I'm fully behind you." And I bet you in her mind, she said, "This kid is not going to get this film done." She didn't. But I bet you she's like, "Oh, that's great, Richard. You go get him." And I'll support you. And I know in her, thought bubble, good luck, kid.
Yeah,
And so 2 movies later, um, I'm glad that she encouraged me. And you never know what's possible in these spaces. And so when we encourage others to do things that might seem impossible, sometimes they are, and
hmm,
sometimes they're not. And so I thank all of those servant leaders out there that give us a sense of, yes, it is worth trying, and it may not work all the time, but it may also work. So be ready for that. And I thank all the servant leaders out there that have done that, including yourself, Vic, and others who are keeping the conversation going to say, yeah, let's consider that we can do this.
absolutely. Richard, thank you so much. This has been such a rich conversation. I thank you for opening up and sharing with us, for being vulnerable with us, and just for leaving us so much to ponder and to think about. And I want to thank our audience for being with us today. And just want to leave this with you that if you are listening to us today, if you're living with mental health challenges, get support. If you're in crisis, you can call or text 988 to be connected to a trained counselor who can connect you with the help, with the services, with the support that you need when you need it most. And that is Strong Talk. Thank you.